Imagine a world where the sky above Europe becomes a battlefield, where drones cross borders, igniting a firestorm of diplomatic tensions. This is not a scene from a science fiction novel, it is today's reality. When Russian drones invaded Polish airspace, a new threshold was crossed. For the first time since the invasion of Ukraine, these unmanned aerial vehicles ventured into a NATO member's territory. The reaction? Fury and alarm. Poland, standing at the forefront, declared that enough is enough. In an unexpected move, Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, boldly proclaimed that NATO must take action. He urged for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, a demand that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Moscow. Sikorski emphasized that the ongoing drone threat from Russia does not only pose a risk to Ukraine but to Europe collectively. We as NATO and the EU could manage this, he stated, but stressed that such a significant decision could not be made unilaterally by Poland. It calls for a united front with allies. Could NATO really respond to this rising threat? Sikorski argued that the safety of citizens would increase if they could intercept drones before they crossed into their airspace. However, while he hinted at the necessity of a no-fly zone, he stopped short of making an outright declaration. His cautious approach reflected an understanding of the geopolitical intricacies involved. What if Ukraine were to request that NATO take action? Sikorski indicated that such a scenario could tip the scales. It was a reminder that any military engagement would need a collaborative effort, with potential risks involved. The question loomed, would Ukraine embrace this proposal? The implications were immense. Yet, why had this idea of a no-fly zone not surfaced earlier? Despite the apparent logic, previous suggestions had been met with outright refusal. NATO was wary of escalating tensions to direct confrontations with Russian aircraft. In the earlier stages of the conflict, when manned fighter jets were actively engaged, the risks were palpable. Today, however, the landscape has shifted, with Russia now relying heavily on drone warfare. The conversation around a no-fly zone had briefly flickered to life in the weeks following the invasion. The UK's Parliament had outlined the complexities involved in establishing such a zone, focused on denying enemy aircraft access to the airspace. But for such a measure to be enacted, legal approval from the United Nations Security Council was imperative, a daunting hurdle knowing Russia's veto power within the Council. Even if this legal barrier could be overcome, the enforcement of a no-fly zone would demand immense resources. As former U.S. Air Force General Philip Breedlove pointed out, simply declaring a no-fly zone was not enough, it required a robust military presence to uphold it. Has a shift in circumstances finally nudged NATO into reconsidering its stance? On September 10, Poland had to intercept suspected Russian drones in its airspace, an event unprecedented since the invasion began. Prime Minister Donald Tusk called it the closest encounter to conflict Poland had faced since World War II. This incident marked a turning point. What unfolded next was a rapid response. Polish F-16s took to the skies, joined by Dutch F-35s, while Italy provided surveillance support. The urgency of the situation was palpable as jets soared, engines roaring, a stark reminder of the looming threat. Reports later confirmed that 19 drones had breached Polish airspace, 3 of which were downed. However, they turned out to be unarmed decoys, yet one still caused damage, crashing onto a civilian home. As tensions escalated, Russia denied any involvement, attributing the drone's origin to Ukraine. Poland, however, sought a meeting with the UN Security Council, gathering support from NATO allies. The Czech Republic and Netherlands pledged assistance, while Germany vowed to enhance its engagement. The question remains, can a united NATO response deter future incursions? Will Poland's bold demand lead to a new chapter in NATO's defense strategy? The world watches, breath held, as the situation unfolds, leaving us to ponder what the skies above Europe will look like in the days to come. Amid rising tensions, Poland found itself at a crossroads. Russian drones had crossed into its airspace, an alarming first since the invasion of Ukraine began. The Polish government was furious. Could this be the spark that ignites a larger conflict? The stakes were high as Poland demanded action from NATO, urging for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. The question loomed, would NATO heed this call, or would it be another empty plea? Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski,
boldly stated that NATO must address the growing threat posed by Russian drones, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe as a whole.
If Ukraine asks us to shoot them down over its territory, that would be advantageous for us, he remarked, hinting at a potential shift in strategy. But Sikorsky acknowledged a crucial point: implementing a no-fly zone would require a coordinated approach with Ukraine. Would Ukraine agree to this high-stakes proposal? The audience was left in suspense. You might wonder why such an idea hasn't been pursued sooner. After all, intercepting Russian drones seems like a no-brainer, right? Yet, each time the notion of a no-fly zone has been raised, it was met with resistance. The Washington Post revealed that NATO hesitated, fearing direct combat with Russian aircraft. In the early months of the conflict, this concern was paramount. Today, however, Russia primarily employs drones, using manned aircraft to launch missiles from afar. Could this shift change NATO's stance? Historical context reveals that the no-fly zone concept has been on the table since the war's onset. Even the UK's Parliament explored the logistics of establishing such a zone back in March 2022. Implementing a no-fly zone involves extensive operations, monitoring airspace, deploying surveillance aircraft, and potentially engaging enemy forces. However, legal hurdles loom large. A no-fly zone requires UN Security Council approval, which is complicated by Russia's veto power. In a chilling twist, as Poland grappled with these issues, a significant incident unfolded. On September 10, Polish forces were compelled to intercept suspected Russian drones. Prime Minister Donald Tusk described this moment as the closest encounter with conflict since World War II. The skies were tense, filled with the roar of scrambling F-16s. Poland's military acted swiftly, while NATO allies prepared their own defenses. The aftermath revealed that the drones were unarmed decoys, yet debris from one struck a civilian home, a stark reminder of the ever-present danger. Poland sought a UN Security Council meeting, and its NATO allies pledged support. Would this incident lead to a reconsideration of NATO's previous reluctance? The air was thick with uncertainty, and the world watched closely as the next chapter unfolded. Would Poland's call for a no-fly zone over Ukraine finally be answered? Only time would tell. Weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, a no-fly zone proposal emerged from the UK Parliament. This idea aimed to deny enemy aircraft access to vital airspace. It would require constant monitoring, deploying surveillance aircraft for threat detection, and taking combat action when necessary. But here's the catch: no-fly zones must have a solid legal foundation before they can be enforced. The UK House of Commons Library outlined essential requirements. First, any proposed no-fly zone must receive approval from the United Nations Security Council. This presents an immediate roadblock for Poland's suggestion since Russia, a permanent member of the Council, possesses veto power over any such initiative. Poland, with the backing of NATO and Ukraine, faces the daunting task of finding a way to displace Russia from its influential position in the UN. Currently, no existing mechanism allows for this, and whether the UN would seek to address this amidst the ongoing conflict is a significant and unresolved question. Assuming the Security Council somehow approves the idea, there are additional challenges. Any no-fly zone must be justified under the principles of individual or collective defense, as stated in Article 51 of the UN Charter. In other words, a nation can only enforce a no-fly zone if there is a clear and present danger to its airspace. Fortunately, the ongoing war provides that context, potentially easing this legal burden. Finally, for a no-fly zone to be viable, the host nation must consent to it, adding one more layer of complexity to the situation. As the diplomatic chess game unfolds, one pressing question looms: how will Ukraine respond to Poland's urgent request? Would it embrace this potential shield, or would it see it as an unwelcome escalation? The plot thickens as we venture further into this precarious landscape. In a world on edge, the tension between Russia and NATO reached a boiling point. Poland found itself thrust into the spotlight when it was forced to intercept drones believed to be Russian, flying dangerously close to its borders. This incident marked an unprecedented moment, stirring up fears of direct conflict. As Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk remarked, it felt like the closest encounter with war since World War II. Yet, he quickly reassured the nation that an all-out conflict wasn't imminent.
But what if that reassurance was just a facade? On September 10, chaos erupted in Poland's skies.
As the faint whir of drones filled the air, alarm bells rang. Polish fighter jets roared into action, scrambling to confront this unexpected aerial threat. The Dutch sent their advanced F-35s into the fray, while Italy deployed an AWACS surveillance aircraft, amplifying the urgency of the situation. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching longer than the last. When the dust settled, reports indicated that 19 drones had strayed into Polish airspace, with at least 3 of them shot down. The aftermath revealed a shocking twist. These drones were unarmed decoys, yet one still caused havoc, smashing into a pensioner's home.
The debris rained down like shrapnel, narrowly missing Tomasz Wesolowski, who was watching the news unfold in real time. In the wake of this dramatic event, Poland's reaction was swift.
The nation immediately called for a meeting of the UN Security Council, demanding answers and support.
But as Russia denied any involvement, claiming the drones had come from Ukraine,
the situation became murkier.
How could Poland protect its airspace while navigating the complex web of international politics?
With NATO allies rallying to support, the Czech Republic and Netherlands pledged to send defensive measures, while Germany vowed to intensify its engagement.
But this raises a crucial question: can NATO afford to ignore the implications of these drone incursions? What if this escalated into something much more significant? As the specter of a no-fly zone over Ukraine loomed larger, the stakes grew higher. If Poland's skies were no longer safe, what would stop Russia from expanding its aggression further into NATO territory?
The possibility of establishing a no-fly zone had been discussed before, but past reluctance stemmed from fears of direct confrontations with Russian aircraft. However, the shift in Russia's strategy toward drone warfare could change everything.
The whispers of a no-fly zone ignited fresh debates among NATO leaders, but what would it take to make this a reality? As the international community held its breath, the question remained: would Ukraine support Poland's push for a no-fly zone over its territory?
The answer to this might hold the key to either escalating the conflict or ushering in a new era of strategic defense.
Previously, we saw how the growing threat of Russian drones crossing into NATO airspace forced Poland to take unprecedented action on September 10.
Now, the moment crossed a line no one expected. Russian drones entered Polish skies for the first time since the war began. Poland's Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, described this moment as the closest brush with open conflict since World War II. Still, he warned there was no immediate danger of full-scale war between Poland and Russia, yet the event shattered old boundaries. Imagine the hum of engines splitting the dawn sky. Polish F-16 fighter jets roared into life, ready to intercept. From the Netherlands, F-35 stealth fighters streaked through the air, while Italy launched a hawk-like AWACS surveillance plane to track every move. Above them, a NATO tanker aircraft filled their fuel tanks mid-air, keeping the Guardians in flight for hours. Reports soon revealed there were 19 drones detected inside Polish airspace. 3 were shot down. At first glance, these looked like harmless decoys, unarmed but ominous. One drone's fragments crashed through the roof of Tomasz Wesolowski's home, landing amid shattered beams and splintered wood that littered his bedroom. He was downstairs, ironically watching the news report on the very incursion that endangered his house. Russia denied any involvement. A Russian diplomat pointed fingers, claiming the drones had come from the direction of Ukraine itself. Yet, this felt like a hollow excuse. Any Russian drone targeting Poland would have to cross through Ukrainian skies, where Russia already flies countless unmanned missions daily. Within hours, Poland demanded an urgent session of the United Nations Security Council. NATO allies pledged swift support. The Czech Republic and the Netherlands promised to send enhanced defenses. Germany vowed to ramp up its presence on NATO's eastern front. France readied a squad of Rafale fighter jets to bolster Poland's sky patrols. This was a moment of reckoning. Could this incident be the spark that finally forces NATO to shift from cautious observers to active defenders in Ukraine's skies? The whispers of a no-fly zone grew louder. But what would Ukraine say? Would they accept weapons and pilots enforcing a protective barrier against Russian drones? The stakes were colossal. The thunder of engines and tension in the air marked only the beginning. From shadows of diplomacy to the risk of direct conflict, NATO's next move could change the fate of Europe forever. What comes next will shake the foundations of power in this sprawling conflict.
Will NATO bite the bullet and draw a line in the sky? Or will caution keep the skies dangerously open? The next chapter is already unfolding. A mysterious drone, tracked by fighter jets, ventured into Romanian airspace, surfacing 12.4 miles southwest of Chileaveș before vanishing from radar.
Dubbed Gagarin, this drone hails from Russia's adaptation of the Iranian Shahed-136, an aircraft they have diligently crafted over several years. While Romania claims this drone posed no immediate danger to populated areas, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, framed the event as a clear escalation of hostilities, a move that could not have been accidental. In just a week, Russian drones breached the skies of 2 NATO countries, shifting the landscape for the potential establishment of a no-fly zone. Historically, NATO hesitated to implement such zones, largely due to Ukraine not being a member of the alliance.
As long as Russian drones remained within Ukrainian boundaries, NATO felt secure. Now, however, the intrusion into NATO territory raises urgent questions. What would be the repercussions if Russian drones continued to invade airspace that NATO countries regard as off-limits?
Poland seems to be taking proactive measures, implementing strict airspace regulations alongside Latvia, significantly curtailing civilian flight operations along their eastern frontiers.
Effective from 10 p.m. on September 10, Poland's restrictions are slated to last until December 9, while Latvia's will only hold until September 18.
This heightened airspace control, while not a full-fledged no-fly zone, aims to preempt civilian aircraft from the threat posed by unmonitored drones.
In light of these developments, the critical question arises: what would an actual no-fly zone over Ukraine look like?
As nations weigh the implications of such a declaration, the stakes could not be higher.
Would unleashing NATO defenses over Ukraine signify a bold move toward an inevitable clash with Russian forces? Imagine that moment of tension when fighter jets rush into the skies, engines roaring. Could the world be on the precipice of a dramatic confrontation? As we analyze the obstacles of establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, we must ponder, what would such a defensive measure mean for the future of NATO and its relationship with Russia?
With shifting political landscapes and rising military tensions, each decision will not only shape the immediate future but could also echo through history itself. What path will NATO choose, and how will the echoes of these critical decisions impact the lives of millions? To recap, the previous discussion explored how, if legal obstacles and NATO hesitations vanished, a no-fly zone over Ukraine would demand intense NATO involvement. NATO jets and air defenses would patrol relentlessly, scanning skies and standing ready to neutralize drones, missiles, or manned aircraft.
But what would this no-fly zone really look like? How deep would its reach stretch, and could it stop Russia's relentless drone assaults?
Imagine the rumble of engines slicing through frigid air as NATO aircraft patrol overhead.
Radar stations buzz and click, scanning every inch of the skyline. A no-fly zone isn't a simple line on a map, it's a tightly woven mesh of air defenses operating non-stop.
To be effective, NATO would need to patrol vast stretches across northern and western Ukraine, where Russia's drones inflict the most damage.
It's not just about Kiev or border towns, it's about denying Russia's drones any safe corridors at all.
News sources highlight that nations like the UK, Turkey, France, and the United States are quietly exploring the idea of carving out partial zones instead of a single blanket ban. Think of it as an intricate shield, a chain of defenses guarding vulnerable regions, creating buffers to blunt Russia's deadly drone raids. The complexity of this shield is staggering. It must allow safe passage for friendly flights while relentlessly hunting down hostile objects. But there's a storm looming beneath this plan. The Atlantic Council warns that a single shot-down NATO jet over Ukraine, or even a destroyed air defense unit on Russian soil, could send shockwaves across Europe. It could spark a diplomatic firestorm no one can fully predict. Is Europe ready to risk such a volatile gamble? To reduce these dangers, NATO might choose to keep its fighter jets away, relying only on missile defenses and radar. But would this diluted approach truly stop the threat? Can a no-fly zone enforced mostly by missile systems without rapid fighter jet intercepts act as a reliable fortress or merely a paper shield? Could Moscow exploit this gap, pressing the edge just enough to provoke, but not enough to ignite full-scale hostilities? The tension hums in the cold air. NATO's leaders stand at a crossroads, balancing the weight of protecting millions against the risk of plunging the continent into chaos.
What daring steps will they take next? Will this complex air defense network rise to the occasion, or crumble under pressure as drones continue to darken Ukraine's skies?
The unfolding saga of this no-fly zone is far from over. Stay tuned to witness the next explosive chapter.
Previously, we saw how deploying fighter jets from NATO into Ukraine's skies risks dragging the alliance into direct combat with Russia.
Now, let's dive deeper into the complicated alternatives that NATO faces to counter Russia's drone onslaught without sparking a wider war.
Imagine replacing fighter jets with more ground-based air defense systems delivered to Ukraine.
This would let Ukraine build a kind of no-fly zone of its own, screening the skies from Russian drones and planes. But here's the catch: if Vladimir Putin ever decided to target NATO directly, his aircraft would then need to enter NATO airspace.
Would NATO be ready to respond or be forced to back down? The risk of escalation hangs heavy in the air. Another possibility lies in arming Ukraine with an expanded fleet of interceptor drones. Let's picture swarms of these drones hunting down their Russian counterparts over Ukrainian territory. Yet, this keeps control firmly in Ukraine's hands, not NATO's.
That's a problem because some NATO voices argue the alliance must present a united, visible front against the Russian threat, not just support from behind the scenes.
This gray zone reveals the brutal reality: imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine is a nightmare to put into practice, even before legal barriers are considered.
Beyond political hurdles, there's the daunting technical challenge of fending off the drone menace itself. The nature of the Russian attack strategy has shifted dramatically. No longer does the Kremlin rely mainly on piloted fighter jets blazing through the sky.
Instead,
it floods the air with endless waves of long-range drones. The New York Times warns that NATO faces a swarm strategy now, a relentless bombardment of cheap, expendable drones. Imagine spending millions of dollars and firing expensive missiles just to shoot down drones that cost a minuscule fraction.
Is that sustainable? Is it even smart?
Clearly, this imbalance eats away at NATO's options, but ignoring the threat is not an option either.
The stakes escalate when we learn just how massive Russia's drone factories have become. Reports reveal a staggering output: about 5,000 long-range drones rolling off production lines monthly. That's 5 times more than what Russia was churning out earlier this year.
Visualize 2,000 drones unleashed in one single night attacking Ukraine. That's the kind of scale Russia is striving for, targeting November 2025 as the point they want to hit that overwhelming number. Such a swarm would choke the skies, saturate defenses, and push Ukraine's forces to their limit. This looming flood forces NATO to seriously reconsider its strategy. Perhaps the wisest move lies not in trying to enforce a traditional no-fly zone but in strengthening Ukraine's own drone defenses, making its skies a deadly maze of anti-drone systems and interceptors.
Will NATO commit to this kind of support? Can Ukraine's technology keep up with Russia's drone tide? Or will we watch from the sidelines as these lethal swarms darken the skies over Europe's eastern front?
The answers are tangled in uncertainty, but one thing is clear: time is running out to counter this silent but overwhelming threat.
In a shocking escalation of tensions, Russia has crossed a critical line by launching drones into Polish airspace. For the first time since the invasion of Ukraine began, these drones ventured beyond the borders of Ukraine, triggering a fierce reaction from Poland and its NATO allies. The implications are vast. Could this be a prelude to a larger conflict? Poland is not just furious, it's demanding action. Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski boldly called for NATO to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine. This is not just a defensive maneuver, it's a powerful statement against Russian aggression.
Sikorski emphasized the growing threat posed by Russia's drone strategy, highlighting that such a zone could protect not only Ukraine but also the safety of European nations.
But what does this mean for NATO's response? As Sikorski hinted, any action requires consensus among allies. If Ukraine were to request assistance in downing Russian drones, would NATO comply? The urgency of the situation begs the question: will Ukraine endorse this dramatic proposal?
Historically, the idea of a no-fly zone has been met with hesitance.
NATO's reluctance stems from fears of escalating into direct combat with Russian forces.
However, with Russia increasingly relying on drones, perhaps the landscape has changed. Poland's recent encounter, where it had to shoot down suspected Russian drones, marks an unprecedented moment.
This is the closest we have come to conflict since World War II, declared Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Amidst the chaos, a shocking twist emerges. Russia's denials and accusations point fingers back to Ukraine, creating a narrative that could justify further aggression. Is this what Putin seeks, a narrative to legitimize a war against NATO? The pressing question remains, will Ukraine agree to a no-fly zone? The answer appears to be a resounding yes. President Volodymyr Zelensky has long advocated for such protective measures, calling it essential for saving lives. Humanitarian no-fly zone, he stated, urging the international community to act decisively. Now, as the stakes rise, NATO faces a pivotal moment. Will they risk the potential for war under the pretext of protecting Ukraine, or will they hold back, possibly allowing Russia to continue its aggressive maneuvers? The world watches, and the answers may redefine the future of European security. Previously, we saw how Ukraine has been open to the idea of a no-fly zone since the early days of the invasion. President Zelensky passionately called for it, describing a no-fly zone as a humanitarian shield that could finally stop Russia's non-stop air attacks on peaceful cities. Ukraine's skies remain painfully vulnerable, even as Moscow shifts to a drone-heavy strategy. But turning this vision into reality faces enormous obstacles, especially NATO's hesitation. Imagine skies darkened by swarms of drones, each one a silent menace. Putin's forces may rely less on manned aircraft and more on these relentless robotic invaders. Yet, without stronger defenses from allies, Ukraine stands exposed. The possibility of a no-fly zone promises hope, a shield in the heavens designed to shoot down these deadly drones before they can strike. But here's where the tension turns electric. Despite the desperate need, NATO's reluctance casts a shadow over Sikorsky's bold proposal. Many remain cautious, fearing escalation and the catastrophic risks of direct confrontation with Russia's forces. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin's desperation becomes clear. He's scrambling, even pleading with Turkey for air defenses. The Kremlin is fraying, its once formidable shield shattered by Ukraine's relentless attacks. What if this reluctance is exactly what Putin counted on? Launching drones into Polish airspace was no accident, it was a calculated gambit to provoke a NATO response and justify a wider conflict. The stakes are higher than ever. Will NATO find the courage to protect Ukraine's skies, or will fear keep it grounded? Stay tuned. Because the skies above Eastern Europe hang in a delicate balance, and the next move could ignite a new chapter in this dangerous game.